Welcome to Out of the Lab, a podcast interviewing entrepreneurs who've taken research out of the lab and built it into a company that's serving the world. These entrepreneurs are heroes, and the planet needs more of them. So tune in, learn from their successes and failures, and get inspired. Visit bountiful.work to join our community and realize your power to save the world. Hello and welcome to Out of the Lab. I'm your host, Max Finder. Today's guest is Carl Schoellhammer. He is the co-founder and president of Suono Bio. Suono is a preclinical-stage startup company focused on the ultra-rapid delivery of novel therapeutics to the GI, gastrointestinal tract. So it actually is a pretty cool technology. They use ultrasound to deliver drugs through the skin. So the first thing that they were targeting is irritable bowel disease like Crohn's, colitis, things like that. And they can deliver drugs by actually passing an ultrasound over the skin. What's very cool about this is Carl developed this technology out of Langer Lab. So Carl was a PhD student and postdoc with Professor Bob Langer. We talk a lot about Bob Langer in this episode because obviously he had a very strong influence on Carl and on Suono Bio. Professor Bob Langer is apparently the most cited engineer in history. He has 800 papers. These are even old figures, and we talk about it in the episode, but it's something like 800 papers, 500 patents, 60 researchers at any given time in his lab. He's probably had 1,000 researchers that have gone through his lab. He's created over 40, something like that, startup companies, hundreds of licensing deals for the technologies that develop in his lab. So we talk a lot about why it's so successful, his lab, what it was like being in there, what it's like working with Bob Langer, and a lot about Suono Bio and the path that they took and how they had everything, according to Bob Langer, to Professor Langer, of what's required for a successful company. So a platform, patents, and papers. So we get into the weeds on that. Carl has tons of great advice for young scientists and grad students and how to build a business out of an invention like Suono Bio. So tune in, enjoy, visit bountiful.work for more and to join our community, and enjoy the episode. Thanks. Carl, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I would love to hear, I guess at the beginning, right? So you did your PhD and your postdoc training in Langer Lab, the infamous Langer Lab. I'd love to hear a little bit even about that. So for folks for some of our listeners who don't know, Professor Bob Langer, Robert Langer is, I think, and I dug this up from the Harvard case study on his commercial.
That's a little old now, and then they did a new one. They did a new one like 2 years ago.
So I have to access that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
He's the I think most cited engineer in history. He holds either the most number of patents or second. If he's second, it's only to Thomas Edison. He has just transformed medicine. I mean, his and his trainees' work have resulted in just, I think like 40 plus companies, licensed or sub-licensed patents to hundreds of companies, and ultimately created a wide range of therapeutic products that are in the clinic today helping people. Just a prolific inventor, academic, mentor. Has had, I think, over 1,000 trainees through his lab now at this point. Just a very unique individual, to say the least.
And so one of those companies was Suono Bio, which you are the co-founder and CTO of.
Yes.
And we'll get into that. I'd love to hear more about the technology itself, but I even love to start with like the kernel of the formation. So you're a postdoc in Bob Langer's lab.
Go ahead. So I started my PhD at MIT in 2010, and I knew Bob was famous, but I didn't know how famous he was. And what that meant was I think some people go to his lab with the idea of, Bob starts companies, I'm going to start a company, boom, boom, boom. I'll be honest, I didn't really have that vision. I was like, I don't want to be an academic. I don't want to become a professor, but I didn't specifically think I was going to start a company. So, I started in Bob's lab, started working on a translational project to, looking at drug delivery and getting drugs across various tissues. So skin, as well as GI tract, and using ultrasound specifically to do it. And Bob and colleagues had kind of a long-standing collaboration of using ultrasound for delivery to the skin, basically breaking down the skin barrier to allow drugs through the skin with the idea of replacing needles. And I'm working on this. And I thought, this works really well. Why can't we use it in other places? And at the same time, I met at the time, he was a postdoc, Gio Traverso, who was a clinical gastroenterologist. He was doing his kind of research fellowship year. So we thought, why don't we start applying this to the GI tract, this ultrasound technology for drug delivery? And long story short, it just worked. What we found was the ultrasound could deliver anything, could deliver small molecules, deliver proteins and biologics, that today are limited to injection. It could even deliver, nucleic acids. I mean, everyone's familiar with mRNA now because of COVID. And the lipid, and having to wrap this mRNA in a lipid to protect it and make it deliverable. We were finding back in Bob's lab that we could deliver even mRNA, this huge molecule, super delicate. We could deliver to the GI tract with no lipid, no encapsulation, no formulation at all. And in science, those things don't happen. Like every time we tried something new, it just worked. It worked the first time. And again, that just doesn't happen in science. And so it was really a result of that and kind of the science just working. That was, like a giant neon sign, like, hey, company here. There seemed to be something pretty special here, something pretty impactful here. And that's what really turned us to, hey, maybe we do need to spin this out and create a company here and do something bigger with this.
And just so we, if we were telling a kindergartner about what the technology does, it's the ability to deliver drugs through the skin. So to access, for instance, the GI tract to somebody's stomach or whatever, you can, using an ultrasound, basically deliver medicine through the skin.
Yeah, so ultrasound is just this incredible technology that's been around for decades clinically. It's used for, most people think of it for imaging, imaging a baby in the womb, for example, and that's at really high frequencies. At low frequency, actually just above basically the limit of our hearing, so tens of kilohertz, you get this phenomenon known as cavitation. So basically the ultrasound, if it's being emitted through a solution, say like that imaging jelly, you apply it through a jelly or a solution, it spontaneously nucleates these little bubbles. And these bubbles swirl around and they eventually get too large. They can't basically sustain their size anymore and they implode. So the surrounding solution rushes in and basically creates this little jet. And it's these jets that achieve the delivery. So in the case of skin, you apply the ultrasound basically directly on the skin, and these little jets very gently basically scrub away the top layer of the skin, which is the most significant barrier. And now the skin is permeable and you can put drugs through it. In the GI tract, again, it's actually local administration. So we've subsequently built out a bunch of form factors and things for application to different parts of the GI tract, but it is local application basically. And in the GI tract, you're not breaking down the barrier actually, you're acting directly on the drug. And basically those bubbles act to physically just push the drug in. So if you can think of it like kind of little miniature micro injections, just gently injecting the drug right into the GI mucosa, the tissue.
And just for the listeners, that's not Carl's stomach growling. That is your dog growling.
Yeah,
that's not your GI tract.
Apologies again. That's the dog. I'm trying to quiet her down. So
no problem.
Chest rubs, which are magical.
It's a growling. It sounds like a growling stomach. So I thought it was quite relevant in a way.
Perfect. Got the sound effects taken care of.
Yeah. So if we think back, I mean, was this like an idea that you came with to the lab, or this was one of the ideas? Like, I'm even curious the mechanics of the lab and how it fosters all of these different startups that come out of it. You know, one of the things well known about the lab is that it's diverse. People say there's diverse backgrounds in order to tackle difficult problems, and it's this kind of cross collaboration of expertise that leads to all of these different breakthroughs. It's even a model that I heard about, for instance, this company Databricks out of UC Berkeley. They designed some of their labs in a way where there's collaboration across disciplines. So it sounds like that's the way the lab operates. I mean, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. You know, and I think it ultimately comes from, you know, Bob's background. I mean, he'll always say when he was doing his own PhD in chemical engineering, you know, at kind of around graduation, all his friends went to the oil industry, and that was a really common, you know, thing to do. And he just didn't want to do that. And he, you know, had the kind of the off chance of meeting a professor, Judith Folkman, who actually gave him a chance and said, "You seem like, you know, a unique person, and, you know, let me take a chance on you." And they started this line of research for angiogenesis inhibitors, basically inhibiting the production of blood flow in tumors and things. But, you know, Bob that was not a known path. A chemical engineer doing something in kind of life science, health. And then even when he first started his lab, you know, he'll tell you, you know, straight up that he just had failure after failure. His grants weren't funded. You know, he was he started at MIT in like the food science department, and that was just because no one knew what to do with him. And even in the food science department, they're like, you don't seem to be making it. You should probably look for a new job. But it was this persistence, and, you know, ultimately he got a grant, he got another grant, and, you know, things started turning the corner. But, you know, that really impacted him. He saw that, you know, you need people who think in different ways. And so when he started building his lab, I think almost from the beginning, you know, he's had biologists, chemists, you know, an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer, and all these people who, you know, maybe traditionally people would look at it and say, well, this is, you know, this doesn't make any sense. This is just a random, you know, collection of people. But, you know, that's how you do really impactful science. You have a bunch of people who think about problems from different directions, and as a result can do really interesting things. And now you see that trend today in a huge way. You mentioned Berkeley. I did my undergrad there. You know, they built a center basically to try and, you know, co-house different disciplines with the hope that, again, they bump into each other and you get this, you know, synergy. MIT with the Koch Institute, actually, where, you know, where the department that Bob's in, or one of the departments Bob's affiliated with, you know, it's kind of a similar approach, you know, trying to put multiple disciplines under one roof, you know, kind of mostly working on cancer and things like this to really get that cross-pollination. And, you know, I hate, it's overused, I hate to say it, but the synergy basically of all these different, you know, trainee backgrounds, you know, tackling a problem from different directions.
Yeah, I wonder in the age of Zoom how that can be potentially replicated. And so this is, and so an example of that is you and Gio, a gastroenterologist,
Yeah, no,
collaborating on this.
exactly. So I start the lab. I mean, I'm traditionally at Berkeley, I was a chemical engineer. At MIT, I was in the chemical engineering department. You know, Gio's he has a PhD as well, in biology from UPenn. You know, but he's a gastroenterologist. And then, you know, we had a material scientist down the hall that we worked a bit with. And then another engineer. And so it was, you know, just this kind of like weird collection of people, if you will. You know, but Gio has just tremendous insight, you know, having done a PhD and obviously the clinical practice now, like what is needed in the clinic and how do you do things? And you have Bob, obviously, who's, you know, been thinking sort of outside of the box now just for, you know, his whole career. And everyone else in that lab, and, you know, you can do really special things with that.
Yeah, and Geo, it sounds like, we on other people on this podcast have talked about the importance of engaging with industry at a very early stage and kind of your
Mm.
customer, right? Because you can learn so much. So, in a sense, Geo is the one with this practical experience
Yeah,
for this problem. So he understood the problem very well.
yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, you can do a lot of things in a lab. We've cured cancer in mice. So, you could do other things kind of in a lab that might not really have relevance to people, or their specific disease for just a variety of factors. So, thinking about back to this technology, when in 2011 we started doing it for GI tissue, and we're like, wow, we can just deliver everything. Well, we're thinking, what do you do with that? And I had a lot of ideas, but from an academic, oh, I read the paper, read this, read that, heard about this disease. um, but Gia was really instrumental in saying, look, there's a disease state called inflammatory bowel disease. You have patients who basically have just severe inflammation of the GI tract. They need really high concentrations of anti-inflammatories locally at the sites of the inflammation within their GI tract. This ultrasound technology seems to, really rapidly deliver high local concentrations of drug. We can deliver an anti-inflammatory. Why don't we actually target that? And then within that, there's even further details. How do you do it? How do you administer it? How would a patient use it? That, an engineer, myself, would never realize or appreciate, if you don't have a clinical viewpoint, if you don't have a direct patient, viewpoint. Um, and so that is critical. And I'd say that's another piece that, Bob has fostered, working closely, with clinicians, with the medical school, because again, there's a lot of things you can do in a lab that are ultimately irrelevant to a patient population.
Yeah, and so can we break down some that journey from looking at the success of this in a lab to starting this to figure out the clinical application and implications of it? I read this quote that Bob said specifically about Suono Bio's technology. It's a platform technology with it has all the elements of a successful company. A platform technology with potentially broad utility, proof that it works in animal models, powerful patents, and publications in top tier journals. I mean, I think we'll get to that, but I'm curious about the decision that says we have something here. We need to create a spinoff. Not just the lab demonstration, but also,
Yeah, that
the
next step.
application to clinicians. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so when things were just just working to be kind of high level.
Which is
um
lucky, by the way, right? I mean, things don't always just work,
oh,
but
and
yeah.
it never works. And yeah, it's complete. I always make sure to try and caveat, like, this is, I'm not some great, I mean, Bob and Gio are great scientists. I'm not personally, a great scientist. So it's not like I was doing some amazing thing and it worked because of me. Like, this is pure sheer dumb luck, and also just leveraging, decades of Bob's work on ultrasound, specifically for the, skin work. But yeah, it doesn't happen. And so that's why it's so rare. I mean, when we were looking to deliver RNA, I remember, this is something that, I'd say Bob and Gio as well, but like, I didn't think would work. And I don't think any of us thought this would work. RNA is a huge molecule. It's so delicate. And not only does it have to get, kind of into tissue, it has to get into individual cells to exert its therapeutic benefit. And this is, the case with mRNA. It has to get into a cell to be utilized. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And so I did this experiment with the ultrasound in animals, and I just started with a disease model and a relevant RNA that should have had therapeutic benefit. So I basically went like to the end goal at the start. And I did this experiment.
Almost naively, in a way.
I mean, not naive, like it all made sense.
Okay,
like
it makes sense on paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm doing it in an animal model that is a disease. The RNA, I chose, targets basically that a biomarker effectively. of that disease, but like, should it be delivered? Should it, be delivered sufficiently to actually resolve disease? Like, those are a lot of open questions. Or will the ultrasound just chew up the RNA? So I literally did that first experiment in like an evening over a week. I had a workshop I was doing, so I just did it on a whim in an evening. And honestly, that experiment, that was publication data. Like, my first stab in the dark. What concentration RNA do I administer? What, how much disease should the animals have? Like, there's all these factors you generally have to optimize. I didn't optimize any of those things. I was like, let me try this. And the curve, the data that came out, it was publication quality. And I remember, talking to Bob about this. I was at that point a postdoc, and my office was, I sat basically like a door away from Bob, and I was telling him about it, and he's like, this is incredible. And I walked away, and he's like, wait, and he yelled across the office. He goes, did we deliver mRNA too? And I was like, yeah, Bob, we delivered mRNA even without, without formulation, without the encapsulation, and to the GI tract, which is, an inhospitable environment that's designed, to chew this stuff up and not take up, these delicate therapeutics. And so that, that led me to then start thinking about a business. Okay, what would be needed? What would the technology do first? As you pointed out in the quote from Bob, we do view it as a platform. And I think that term is wholly overutilized. But I do think this is truly a platform because we've demonstrated it, in the publication. So we can deliver throughout the GI tract. We can deliver any therapeutic class. And so we wanted to think about, what do you do first, basically, to de-risk the platform and be really smart about it, be capital efficient, and really start building value. So I started doing various accelerator activities at MIT. We did the MIT 100K that we were finalists in. And that basically allowed me to just get a lot of free advice from a lot of smart people, clinicians who were, additional clinicians who were mentors, entrepreneurs in the ecosystem, VCs, but still under kind of the, safe umbrella guise of like, I'm a student at MIT, I'm doing the 100K competition, this and that.
What's the importance of that, the safe umbrella guys?
Well, I mean, if you're already like outside of that, you're jobless, you're bootstrapping this, like that can be pretty dire as well. And also, if you don't have, and if you're not a student, maybe people are a little less likely to speak with you. But if you're a student, you're just trying to learn something more. People are generally, quite happy to talk to you and lend their advice.
Yeah.
And so that basically.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say, from we started that in basically like late 2014. So we only officially started the company in 2017. So it was another 2.5 years of trying to think very methodically and carefully and refining the business plan and the strategy and what a company would do, because again, it's not straightforward. The science isn't easy, but the company building is just as not easy, let's say. So I think the movies show, you go out, you get your check, you celebrate, you pop the champagne, you're sitting in your big office. Now, like it's just not like that.
Yeah, well, and Bob has a ton of experience. I mean, he's spun out, at least in the old case study I read, I don't know, a dozen startup companies or something like that.
Oh, it's like 40 plus.
It's
now.
40
yeah.
now. Okay.
Oh, it's yeah. And it's funny, like I actually just heard or read another article with him, and he still said 40, but he's been saying 40 now for like 5 years. So I think he's being generous. It's it's probably like 50, 60 or something.
And so he has this experience. I mean, can you speak a bit about some of the things that he prioritized, for instance, or the advice? Like, was it his advice to go to these accelerators as the first kind of step, or?
Yeah, a bit. I'd say his advice number one. So Bob is infinitely supportive. everyone views him as, obviously there's just a luminary in the field, to say the least. And, no one ever thinks that you can just approach a luminary. But at the end of the day, Bob is still an academic. And he's, by choice, he's spent his career in academia, and he loves seeing his trainees succeed. He loves seeing them flourish and go on to do what they want to do, whether that's, start a new lab, start a company, go to industry, whatever. So whatever you want to do, he's incredibly supportive, and he'll support you in that. With the company piece, I'd say his first, advice, and kind of the trademark advice, is that platform, paper, patent. So one, try and have a platform, something that's broader than, a single product, a single asset, something that could be really impactful. The paper, it's trying to have a marquee publication that demonstrates, not that just you have a good data set, but that it went through peer review. Others looked at it and validated, hey, that is a good data set, that is interesting. So to have, that marquee publication, and then ultimately 3 patents, right? You need to be able to protect, the technology or the platform. And so to have those things. And so, that's what we focused on. We were able to ultimately first publish this technology in Science Translational Medicine, which is just a phenomenal translational journal within the science family. The RNA work, we shot even higher. We published that in the journal Gastroenterology, which is the top GI journal in the world. It has an impact factor of, over 20 now. So you're talking about a similar kind of science nature territory. And that just helps, because when you're going out ultimately to, hone your plan to, pitch VCs, you need to have strong and compelling data. And if something's peer reviewed and it's been published, that is compelling. And I have to say, it's magnificent advice. Don't just generate the first curve and try to go get money. Like, I think I was talking to Gio about this recently. I don't think there's ever been a pitch. VCs will have tons of questions, question this, question that. I don't think there's ever been a pitch we've done or an investor we've spoken to who had questions about the data, who doubted the data or wasn't sure whether it, truly worked. That piece is just a given, because, to Bob's advice, made sure to just publish a number of studies on this that are out there, that are peer reviewed, and in really good journals.
And publishing, though, is quite counterintuitive with patenting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't. You need to have the applications, the patent applications filed before you make public disclosures, and a publication is a public disclosure. But as long as you have that in place, at least in the U.S. now, you have the first to file standard. So if you have that, filed, you're good. You can then publish. And I'd say particularly in life science, healthcare space, it is really important, to publish ultimately. It's not. I don't know tech. Maybe it is hard to make apps, but I think it's probably easier. In health, it's much harder to develop products. You need a lot of time, a lot of data, and you have a really high bar. If you're potentially going to put something into humans, you need to make sure it's safe. And so it's really important to be open, with your data, publish where you can. Obviously, you're not going to be able to publish everything, but be really upfront with that. And so there is also a huge benefit to the publication.
Yeah, and it feels like a really good company quality, company culture to have, to, like, I guess, always be looking to publish, right? I mean, you're continuing to innovate and invent, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at Moderna, I mean, they're a great example of this today. Everyone now knows Moderna, and BioNTech and Pfizer as well. But between those groups, I mean, they've largely brought the world from its knees back out into the sun. And Moderna early on, one of the biggest criticisms was they weren't publishing. And part of that was just you do, when you're in a company, need some time to kind of build the platform, and there are going to be trade secrets and various things that you just can't publish on, and you need to kind of mature the tech. And that's what they did. But you look now, did it matter that they didn't publish early on? Well, no, because their technology was incredibly solid, has been rolled out across the world, and has knock on wood, largely defeated, thankfully now, the pandemic.
And when we think about patents, were you engaged with MIT's technology licensing office? Were you involved in that?
Yeah, so that's the other piece. Yeah, so MIT just has prolific licensing office. They do a really good job managing IP. The inventors are involved. They help direct kind of what should be claimed, what shouldn't be claimed, what can the technology do, to try and really draft quite broad patents. So I got to work closely with the TLO. Lauren Foster within the TLO is just phenomenal to really craft the initial, what would initially be the portfolio ultimately for Suono. So you create that ring fence, and then once the company starts filing material, it gets more specific, and so it's kind of the pickets, if you will, in the fence, to really create a solid foundation of IP. But yeah, the initial is definitely the academic filing, in my case obviously from MIT, that really goes broad to protect the space ultimately.
And did you start to chase non-dilutive funding at this point, NIH or NSF and other grants like that?
Yeah, so we got it. We got a lot of these pieces set, and we actually went for venture funding. Okay. And I'd say back to Bob, I think there's a bit of a misconception in that people people see from the exterior, and they see Bob starting companies, and they assume student has an idea and Bob just calls up a VC and boom, check's written, and you're on your way. But that's not how it is. And I think it's actually to Bob's credit that he supports his students and he supports us, but he also needs wants you to kind of build and grow, and you need to show that it's worth its salt, and can ultimately be a company or raise around. And so he will help you with that, he will support you with that, but you've got to kind of prove it. And that's important, because ultimately if the student's leading it, they need to have a really solid plan. They need to really know there's a company. Two, it's again just external validation. The publication is one level of validation externally outside of a lab. Others have said yes, this data is good, or this data is real. But raising around is similarly another validation point, and a big validation point. It says yes, someone else is willing to actually put their money where their mouth is on this technology. And I think it actually really helps the company start stronger, building a more solid foundation, a more solid plan, by having to kind of go through that and build the plan, build the pitch, successfully pitch VCs, as opposed to, Bob hypothetically just, calling up someone, and, the check gets written, and, you're on your way. It's like anything. You always start kind of small, under the radar, and that really allows you to get very strong, and ultimately I think be more successful. So we did that. We raised our seed mid 2017 from the Engine, Polaris, and a couple of other investors, And that really got us on our way. Speaking of the engine, I think we were actually their first investment they officially made. I was just thrilled to work with, Katie Ray, and now the other partners, Ann DeWitt, and what they're building at the engine. They're just phenomenal supporters. And now as a company, we can chase some additional, non-dilutive funding as well. You have to be careful with non-dilutive funding. It's great, it's non-dilutive, obviously, but it can be, I don't want to say a distraction, but it's non-dilutive funding. These grants aren't specifically for building technology or translational technology or making a company. And so you sometimes have to write the grant differently than how you would actually do the work at a company. And so you do have to kind of be careful with those trade-offs. I mean, you could chase grants forever, but they might not be the best path, ultimately for a company.
You're saying it's more that there's less of a focus in these grants on commercial activity, or I guess the dollar signs at the bottom line, and so it's more exploratory.
Yeah, a bit of that. I mean, yeah, exactly right. I mean, in our case, for example, the ultrasound. We're a therapeutic company, but the ultrasound, it's a device at the end of the day. So there's some technology development. I don't think there's a grant out there specifically for, say, developing like an ultrasound device to deliver drugs. Now, I could find a grant and make the aims fit, and I ultimately might be doing, different work than just putting my head down, focusing, and building our first ultrasound platform, as an example. It's the same with the accelerator competitions. The point of an accelerator competition, and this will sound really weird, but it's not to win. It's to, grow and hone your plan. And honing your plan might mean you realize that it's not a good plan, or the technology doesn't work, or it's not a company, and that's okay. But you're honing and refining. When I say it, the goal isn't to win. It's really because when you look at these competitions, the 100K, we were finalists in that competition, but who were we competing against? Well, it was generic companies, right? It's just ultimately, it's kind of it's a business plan competition. So you're competing against apps, you're competing against, kind of hardware, non-life science, energy companies, all this stuff. And ultimately, I think the winner was like an app or something. And, for fair reasons. They can create a product in 6 months, they can start generating revenue in 8 months, and, go on their way. You want to be careful about not trying to chase the win. I could have done a lot of artificial work to create maybe a more compelling business plan for the sake of this competition, but that wouldn't be what Suono would want to execute on, wouldn't be the business plan that Suono, would operate on. And so you do have to be careful with, non-dilutive funding, with accelerators, to make sure you're still doing relevant work to what the company, would ultimately do, rather than, getting an artificial win, or, just putting something on paper that looks attractive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't know how long ago. It sounds like it was about 6 or 7 years ago, but I mean, how close to that plan has Suono followed on its trajectory? I mean, do you remember some elements of that plan?
Yeah.
And even distilled kind of higher level ideas on best practices for that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say we followed fairly closely. So we, early on triaged a large landscape of disease indications that we could go after, to start, basically. So knowing that kind of inflammatory bowel disease, would be a huge piece to solve. But with a platform, trying to be very strategic to layer on complexity. So, there's a device component. It's a new delivery technology. Let's start with an old drug, let's say. Let's not do, new delivery and new drug, like an RNA, just from the get-go. Let's layer it on. So we start with an old drug. We can, create a better treatment option for patients in various indications. And so doing this landscape analysis, found the indication of ulcerative colitis that can be our lead, to de-risk the platform, hopefully get it into the patients, get it ultimately approved. And then the next product layers on complexity. You layer on now a novel therapeutic, like a biologic, and ultimately layer on to RNAs. You can just grab an RNA off the shelf and start developing that. And you don't need to do any formulation workup, any lipid encapsulation, anything like that. But you start very carefully trying to de-risk while building that value. So we did that triage, found our indication, did initial work to still build out the patent landscape and the patent portfolio. And I think that set us up for for success, and now really just running really hard towards first in human in our first indication.
Very cool. And while we're on this kind of topic, actually, could you explain the difference in the technology between tethered and topical? Yeah,
so it can be synonymous. So most people think of topical as on the skin. What we say, or how we use it, is any local delivery to a tissue. So if I'm doing local administration to the GI tract or to the colon for some of these indications, I would refer to that as topical as well. You're applying a drug right on the tissue you want to deliver it to. We have the idea of various form factors, one of which is a tethered system. So this would be something that could be passed through a colonoscope or an endoscope. And now a gastroenterologist, over the course of what is traditionally largely a diagnostic procedure, a colonoscopy or an endoscopy, could now pass a tethered system with ultrasound, deploy the ultrasound, and now administer drug over the course of a diagnostic procedure. So now you took a diagnostic procedure and made it a treatment procedure ultimately. This is one of the things that got Fujifilm interested, who's a strategic investor in Suono. They have drugs, not a lot of people know about that. They have devices, they have endoscopes, colonoscopes. Wouldn't they love to have a tethered system that you could pass through a colonoscope? And now a doctor could start delivering drugs right when they're diagnosing things. That would be huge.
Yeah, you can think about it having several different types of drugs depending on what it finds once it's in there, right?
Exactly. And the delivery is such that it's agnostic to the drug. So you don't need to change anything about the ultrasound, based on what drug you want to deliver.
That's super cool. And so again, I'm always curious about the formation and the trajectory of these things. So you and Gio start pushing this thing forward. It sounds like you had another kind of a co-founder who was a life sciences VC join. Was it you and Gio most of this time for several years, kind of pushing things forward, continuing to de-risk, working on patents, things like that?
Definitely Bob too. Bob's been there, 100% of the way. I don't know how he does it. I just think there's like 3 of him cloned or something. He keeps the other 2, hidden in the closet or something, or he doesn't sleep. But he's right there. Thinking about drafting now patent applications as the company, with the company's IP council, reviewing those, thinking about, the core application, that was a huge piece of it, really triaging. And, what's that first indication you go after? Do you do this stepping stone approach? Do kind of smaller indications first, or do you go straight for kind of the home run, but which is, more risky? We're doing sort of stepping stone and now really head down for ulcerative colitis, and just, pushing it forward that way. And there's not great days, and there's better days. Sometimes experiments don't work, things like that. That's a not great day, but then getting, a strategic investor like a Fujifilm or an NTK, which is another, phenomenal Japanese med device company, getting groups like that bought in, those are good days then, obviously, to say the least. So yeah.
And the importance of these strategics, I mean, they validate it. They have a much larger platform to be able to export your technology. I mean, do you learn from them in a lot of ways as well?
Absolutely. I mean, they have just, a global footprint, global operational capabilities. You learn from them because they have just, phenomenal R&D capabilities, obviously. And I'd say, that early on is another key piece of company formation, trying to get a partnership. Because one, that can often be sort of, non-dilutive, so to speak, cash, some sort of collaboration. It's incredibly validating as well. And ultimately can really help you steer towards, a lean path towards, creating a product. Companies don't really care about doing research necessarily for the sake of research. And so really honing and keeping you focused on driving towards, making a product ultimately, and in the case of healthcare and life sciences, a product that, can go into people and be really impactful and important for them.
And so that was something you pursued in an early stage, was a partnership, a collaboration agreement with a large industrial player?
Yeah, I mean, we have Fujifilm involved as a strategic investor. I met them fairly early, through MIT, and we just kind of kept that conversation going, and ultimately, did lead to an investment, and they've been a great group to, get to have here, get to, advise the company. Get to see the way they think about problems and how they do things. So, I mean, it's been, tremendous validation for the company, but then also just great, learning and sort of mentorship from them as well.
It's amazing. It continues to be underscored, the importance of engaging industry at an early stage.
Exactly. That is critical. That is critical.
And so you're really a long way away from being a PhD student and a postdoc, negotiating deals with Fujifilm, and I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it doesn't. Some days it doesn't feel like it, but yeah, I guess time wise, yeah, it's funny. As much things stay the same, they change. It's running a company can be not dissimilar to a PhD. You got a board that's like your thesis committee. You got to convince them that what you're doing is right. You got to get other people to buy in. You want to do a collaboration, you got to get that person to buy in and bring their resources. In this case, in the case of a company, it's now another company, and their resources are cash or capabilities. So it's funny. There's some analogies to kind of doing a PhD, but yeah, I'm quite a bit removed now, I guess, from the bench.
And if you were quite a bit removed from the bench, I like that. And so, if you had to give advice to that younger PhD student, or, at that stage, maybe in your life, what would you say to young Carl Schoellhammer?
Yeah, I mean, it's, talk to clinicians and patients when you can, as early as possible, because ultimately, your mouse isn't giving you feedback. The other, cell culture isn't giving you feedback. And there's a lot of things you can do that, again, just, don't have relevance to the clinic. So as early on as you can, talking to these folks, you're going to gain and learn a tremendous amount that's only going to accelerate, ultimately, your research and what you do in your technology development.
Amazing. And any other pieces of wisdom for young grad students, entrepreneurs, anything else you want to say?
Just the usual. It sounds cliche, but it is a long, hard struggle. And don't be dissuaded when you see success from others. Just remember that it's always the iceberg effect. Right? Any success you see of someone else, it's just that little tip above the surface. And there was a whole lot of failure and a whole lot of struggle and a whole lot of, other stuff that person had to, slog through and go through. And so, when you're similarly kind of slogging through things, just remember, like everyone else is, even the ones that look the shiniest and the fanciest and the most award winning, like they're slogging too, so you just got to grind.
Right. Keep on keeping on. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Carl, I think it's a great place to stop. Where can people find you if you're open to that, to reach out?
Yeah, so I would say check out the Suono Bio website, suonobio.com. I have a meager Twitter presence, but a little bit of a presence, CMBS6 on Twitter. And I'm sure my email is track downable. Anyone wants to reach out, certainly send me a note. I'd be happy to answer back, or find me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Carl Schoellhammer from Suono Bio, thanks very much for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Pleasure speaking with you.
Yep. Visit bountiful.work for more. Thanks everyone for listening. Enjoy. Thanks for listening. But now we need your help. We're building a community of scientists, students, entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and investors to commercialize meaningful technology and research. Join us at bountiful.work today to find opportunities and realize your power to save the world.